That afternoon, my father remarried at the age of 64. The church hall smelled of polished wood and coffee in paper cups. Neighbors whispered behind folded programs while cousins fanned themselves with hymnals. When he lifted his glass, I thought for one fragile moment that maybe he would honor me. Instead, he looked straight at me and said that I was not worthy to carry his name. I had worn the uniform of the United States Army for more than 25 years. I had led soldiers through deserts and through nights so dark that even the stars seemed to hide. I had buried friends with folded flags and saluted until my arm ached. Yet none of that steadied me against the sting of that single sentence. It cut through the years and pulled me back into the small Tennessee kitchen where I first learned what it meant to endure. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. And share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. I walked out of that hall and into the evening heat. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and violet. My shoes clicked against the pavement as if marking time with my own heartbeat. Cicadas sang from the trees, their buzzing loud enough to drown the music drifting from inside. I leaned against my car and tried to steady my breathing. I was a colonel in the United States Army, yet in that moment I was once again a daughter dismissed. Memory has a way of folding time. I saw my mother, long gone now, standing in her nurse's scrubs, telling me that strength is not about fighting every battle. It is about choosing which ones matter and carrying them clean. I thought about the soldiers I had led, the long nights in war zones, the responsibility that never left my shoulders. I thought about dignity, how fragile it feels when family strips it away, and yet how powerful it becomes when you claim it back. Out in that parking lot, I wrestled with silence. I knew I could leave and no one would blame me. I could drive the interstate north until the whole night swallowed the insult. But I also knew that sometimes silence carries a cost heavier than words. My father had spoken in front of everyone. The lie hung in the air, waiting for me to either let it stand or face it. I opened my trunk and stared at the garment bag resting there. Inside lay the uniform that had carried me through 25 years of service. The green jacket pressed sharp, the ribbons lined with precision, the eagle of a colonel gleaming silver. It was more than fabric. It was the story of every mile, every sacrifice, every life I had vowed to honor. And when I finally walked back into that room wearing it, everything changed. I have always believed that a life is built much like a house. You start with beams and nails, some of them straight and true, some already warped, and you do the best you can with what is in your hands. My earliest beams were laid in a town that most maps barely noticed, a small Tennessee place where the summers were sticky and long, and the winters rattled through thin walls with a whistle that kept you awake at night. Our home was not much more than a square box with faded paint, a porch that sagged in the middle, and a screen door that squealed every time you pushed it open. My mother, who wore tired sneakers and always smelled faintly of antiseptic, worked the night shift at the county hospital. She was a nurse, though I sometimes thought of her as more of a soldier than I would become in those early years. She stitched wounds, calmed mothers, and stood through hours when others collapsed from fatigue. She was the steady rhythm in our house. My father, Ray, was different. He had strong arms, calloused from years of carpentry, but his words cut as sharp as any saw. When he spoke, it was often with a sneer, as though life had shortchanged him and we were the proof of it. He loved me in his own fractured way, or so I tried to believe, but love from him was never gentle. It was discipline without tenderness, demand without encouragement. There were nights I would sit at the kitchen table doing schoolwork, and he would look over my shoulder with a grunt. "That is all you have in you," he would say. "You will never get farther than this town." I learned early to fold those words into myself like scraps I would not throw away but also could not digest. My mother would wait until he left the room, then lay her hand softly over mine and whisper that I was more than what he said. She never shouted at him. She never fought him with volume. Instead, she gave me her quiet assurance, which in the long run built me far more than his harshness ever did. I often ask myself now, and maybe you have wondered the same about your own past, what shaped you more, the encouragement or the doubt? Was it the praise you received, or was it the challenge of being told you could not do something? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you carry fuel from the words that tried to break you or from the hands that lifted you? In high school, I was not the star of anything. I was not the head cheerleader or the girl who got crowned at homecoming. I was steady. I showed up, I did the work. Teachers noticed that steadiness, even when grades were only average. On one report card, a teacher wrote, "Sarah follows through." At the time, it felt small, almost disappointing compared to others who received notes about brilliance or talent. Yet years later, that phrase would feel like the truest description of who I was meant to be. Money was tight. While other kids saved for cars or weekends at the lake, I saved for bus fare and textbooks. I delivered newspapers at dawn, folding them with stiff fingers in the cold, and in summer I mowed lawns until my arms ached. I watched my friends dream about leaving, and I promised myself I would actually do it. When I was a teenager, my father had a way of turning even good days into shadows. There was one evening, I was maybe 15, when we sat at the dinner table with plates of meatloaf and green beans my mother had worked hard to prepare after a 12-hour shift. My father looked at me across the table, his fork poised like a weapon, and said, "You will never be more than your mother." He meant it as an insult. I remember looking at my mother, the fatigue in her eyes, and thinking if I could be half of what she is, I will already be ahead of most. The world outside our little town seemed so far away, but it beckoned to me like a horizon does when you are standing on a hill. I wanted something larger than the walls of our house, larger than the expectations that weighed me down. I wanted to prove, mostly to myself, that I was not bound by the smallness of his words. College seemed impossible. We did not have the money, and I did not have the grades for big scholarships. But the Army Rock recruiter visited our high school during my senior year. He wore a uniform that was crisp and steady, and when he spoke about duty and leadership, it was as if he described a path I had been longing for without ever knowing its name. I learned that if I joined the Rock program at the University of Tennessee, I could not only earn my degree but also train as an officer. I remember telling my mother, half afraid she would cry, half afraid she would refuse. She did cry, but not from disappointment. She cried because she saw, perhaps before I did, that this was my chance. She told me, "Sarah, you want out, then earn it." I hugged her in that small kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator in the background, and I promised her that I would. The years that followed were a blur of study, drill, and determination. I was not the fastest runner or the sharpest mind, but I was consistent. I learned to push through when my legs trembled. I learned to carry the weight of a rucksack and the weight of responsibility at the same time. When others gave up, I stayed. When others shouted loudly, I spoke steadily. By the age of 22, I stood in front of the flag and took the oath of office. Second Lieutenant Sarah Coleman. My father did not come to the ceremony. My mother did, standing proud in her nurse's uniform because she did not have time to change after her shift. When I looked at her, I saw everything I had been built upon. She was the first wooden beam in my house, straight and strong, even if life had weathered her edges. Sometimes I think back to that moment and wonder what it must have felt like for her. To see her daughter rise above the town limits, above the insults, above the doubt. I like to imagine she felt vindicated, that every night she had stitched wounds and mopped sweat from foreheads in that hospital was now reflected in the silver bar on my collar. Have you ever had someone believe in you quietly, without speeches or banners, but in a way that stayed with you for a lifetime? If you have, I would love for you to share it in the comments. Those small moments matter more than we think. The Army became not just my career but my second home. The discipline I had learned in that modest kitchen became discipline in barracks and training fields. I began to understand leadership not as shouting or demanding, but as walking beside those who carried heavy loads. I learned to listen, to study the details, to make decisions that would hold under pressure. Through it all, the voice of my father lingered. His words were like splinters beneath the skin, always there, never fatal but never forgotten. Each time I accomplished something, each time I was saluted or commended, I would feel that small echo whispering that it was not enough. It is strange how even as adults, decorated and recognized, the old wounds remain raw. There were nights in college when I would lie awake, the sound of trains in the distance, and I would imagine a different life. One where my father looked at me with pride. One where my mother did not have to carry so much weight alone. Those dreams fueled me as much as the training did. They reminded me of why I had chosen this path. why I had to keep pressing forward even when exhaustion threatened to pull me under. In those early years, I began to grasp a truth that has stayed with me. Resilience is not born in moments of triumph. It is born in small kitchens with flickering lights, in whispered encouragements, in paper routes before dawn. It is born in the quiet places where no one is applauding, and yet you choose to keep going. When I look back now, I can see how every piece fit together. My mother's steady hands, my father's sharp words, the smell of wood dust in his shop, the antiseptic on her scrubs. They all became beams in the house of my life. Some bent, some straight, some scarred. Together they formed the structure that would hold me through deserts, wars, and heartbreak. And yet, no matter how strong that house seemed, one sentence spoken in a church hall decades later had the power to shake it. That is the strange and cruel force of family. They know where the beams are weakest. They know how to press on the cracks. But cracks are not collapse. They are reminders of where the light can enter and where strength must be tested again. When I raised my right hand and swore to serve, I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I imagined that once I stepped onto the parade fields and into the barracks, my father's words would lose their sting. But the truth is, you carry your beginnings with you, no matter how far you travel. The first months as a new lieutenant were brutal in a way that was different from childhood. There was no kitchen table, no smell of antiseptic or sawdust. Instead, there was the sharp tang of boot polish, the rattle of mess trays, the constant press of expectation. I had to earn respect from soldiers who were often older than me, men and women who had already been tested in ways I could not yet imagine. At Fort Benning, the heat clung to you like a second skin. The Georgia air was thick, heavy, and alive with insects. I remember standing in formation, sweat dripping down my back, the weight of my gear digging into my shoulders. My voice had to carry steady when I called commands, even when my heart beat fast and doubt pressed in. It was in those moments that my mother's words returned to me. Stand tall, do the work, do not bow your head. I made mistakes, everyone does. I misread maps, miscalculated times, lost my way in training exercises. But I learned faster than my failures. Each stumble carved deeper discipline into me. When I doubted, I reminded myself that steadiness had always been my gift. I wonder if you have had seasons like that, where every day felt like a test you might fail, and yet you showed up anyway. Where your strength did not come from perfection but from persistence. If so, share it in the comments. Sometimes hearing how others kept going can be the rope that pulls someone else forward. After training, I received my first posting. Fort Campbell, straddling Kentucky and Tennessee, became my proving ground. The base was vast, filled with the thrum of helicopters and the endless hum of activity. I was still young, still learning, and every task carried weight. We moved supplies, planned logistics, and prepared for deployments that always seemed both far off and too close. The barracks were cinder block, painted in shades of beige that tried to hide the cracks. I shared thin walls with laughter, arguments, and the restless shuffling of soldiers who longed for home. Nights were filled with the smell of sweat and starch, the echo of footsteps on tile. It was not glamorous, but it was real, and it bound us together. During one field exercise, a storm rolled over us with a fury that shook the ground. The rain came down in sheets, soaking through gear and plastering hair to our faces. Radios sputtered, maps blurred, orders had to be shouted through the roar of wind. I remember standing there, soaked to the bone, looking at my soldiers and realizing they were waiting for me. Not for perfection, not for brilliance, but for steadiness. That night I learned that leadership is not about being the loudest voice. It is about being the one who does not flinch when everything else is breaking loose. It was in those years that I began to understand the difference between the weight of command and the weight of family. Soldiers might curse you, challenge you, even resent you, but when you stood steady, they followed. Family was different. Family knew your weakest places, and they pressed on them not because of duty, but because of something older, messier, and harder to define. I tried to keep those worlds apart, army on one side, family on the other. But of course, life never honors such neat divisions. Letters from home carried both love and disappointment. My mother's handwriting always steadied me. Her notes were brief, written in hurried script between shifts. Proud of you, she would write. Keep going, come home safe. My father rarely wrote. When he did, it was usually a short line about a neighbor's wedding or a job he had finished. nothing that touched the heart. Once, after a training graduation, he did show up. He stood in the crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When the ceremony ended, I walked toward him, my uniform crisp, my boots polished, ribbons pinned with care. For a moment, I thought maybe he would soften. Instead, he said, "So you are an officer now. Do not forget you are still a Coleman." The words were not pride, they were warning. I nodded, said nothing, and walked on. Have you ever longed for someone's approval only to realize it may never come? What did you do with that longing? Did you release it, or does it still echo in you? Feel free to share in the comments if you are comfortable. Your words might resonate with someone carrying the same ache. As the years passed, deployments came. Iraq first, then Afghanistan. Desert heat that swallowed the horizon, dust storms that turned noon into midnight. We built convoys across miles of barren land, tracked supplies, and prayed that each vehicle would make it through without striking hidden danger. At night I lay in tents, sand in my teeth, writing letters for soldiers too young or too weary to find the words. I saw courage and fear, often in the same breath. I saw young men cry for their mothers and then stand tall in firefights. I learned that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move anyway. I carried home not medals, though I received some, but memories of faces, names, and sacrifices that could never be measured on paper. Each time I returned stateside, I found myself pulled between relief and restlessness. Home was quiet, too quiet. I would sit in my small off-base apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and feel the absence of engines, radios, and voices. It was in those silences that my father's voice crept back in. He never shouted anymore. By then he had aged, slowed, and his words carried less volume. But the memory of his tone was louder than any artillery I had ever faced. When my mother passed away, I felt the ground shift beneath me. She had been my anchor, the one steady beam that held me when everything else wavered. I stood at her graveside in uniform, saluting a woman who had never worn one but had lived with the same discipline, the same sacrifice. My father stood across from me, his eyes dry, his jaw set. He did not speak to me that day. Not a word. Loss changes you. It strips away illusions and leaves only what is real. For me, it left a sharper divide between the life I had built and the family that refused to see it. I buried my grief in work, in soldiers who needed guidance, in missions that demanded everything. But grief has a way of seeping through, no matter how tightly you lock it away. At Fort Campbell, promotions came slow but steady. First lieutenant, then captain, then major. By 40, I wore the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel. Each step was marked not by grand celebrations, but by the simple nods of respect from those who served beside me. That was enough. More than enough. And yet every achievement seemed to vanish the moment I stepped back into my father's orbit. To him, I was still the girl at the kitchen table, never enough, never worthy. He remarried once briefly to a woman who left after a few years. Then came Marla, younger, eager, and determined to polish the edges of his roughness. Their wedding at 64 would be the scene of my undoing, though I did not know it then. I often think now of the strange duality of life. You can carry medals in one hand and insults in the other. You can be saluted in uniform and dismissed in plain clothes. You can be both colonel and unwanted daughter in the same breath. That is the tension many of us live with, even if the details differ. So I ask you as you listen, have you ever lived that contradiction? Have you been honored in one space yet diminished in another? How did you reconcile it, or are you still searching for the way? Share if you wish. Someone listening right now may need to hear they are not alone. Looking back, I see that my childhood did not end in that Tennessee house. It carried into every decision, every command, every deployment. The first wooden beams, laid crooked or true, remained part of the structure no matter how many stories I built upon them. My mother's strength, my father's doubt, the smell of antiseptic, the echo of saws, all of it stayed. But here is the other truth. Beams can be reinforced. The cracks can be mended. What begins as weakness can become the very place you learn to stand. That is what I carried into adulthood, into the army, into every battle both abroad and at home. And so when I walked back into that church hall years later, wearing the uniform pressed sharp, I was not just confronting my father. I was standing for every splintered word, every quiet night, every mile that had brought me there. The story of that night belongs to another chapter. But the foundation for it, the reason I could stand steady when the room fell silent, was built long before. It was built in that kitchen with my mother's gentle voice. It was built in paper routes and late-night studying. It was built in deserts and barracks and storms that tested every nerve. The first beams were not perfect. They rarely are, but they held. And because they held, so did I. I used to believe that promotions came with fireworks, that the army would hand you a new rank with ceremony and thunder. What I learned instead was that advancement came quietly. It arrived in the form of a late-night meeting when the room was almost empty, or in the weight of a folder passed across a desk, or in the final signature at the bottom of a responsibility log. By the time I left Fort Moore, the post once known as Fort Benning, I was steadier than the girl who first walked across that parade field. The red Georgia soil clung to my boots, and in many ways it still does. It was there that I learned the truest shape of leadership. Leadership was not the shouting. It was the discipline to stand when your knees wanted to fold. It was the ability to look at soldiers who doubted you and show them through action that you were not going anywhere. I remember one morning run through the woods when fog clung so thick to the ground we could barely see a few steps ahead. Sweat poured into my eyes, branches clawed at my arms, and every muscle in my body begged me to slow down. I kept going. When we broke through the fog at last, soldiers looked to me not because I was the fastest, but because I was still there, still pushing, still steady. That moment stayed with me through every deployment. Iraq was a world away from Georgia, yet some things never changed. The weight of a pack, the rhythm of boots on dirt, the way fear presses in but steadiness pushes back. The desert was both vast and suffocating. The heat swallowed us whole, days blurring into one another until even time seemed warped. Nights were a different trial. Darkness stretched across the horizon, broken only by distant fire or the hum of generators. It was in that silence that loss felt closest. One night in Iraq, I sat beneath a canopy of stars that looked close enough to touch, and I wrote the hardest letter of my life. A young soldier under my command had been killed. The kind of death you can never make sense of, a moment too fast and too cruel. Regulations required that I notify his family. There is no handbook for that task. No training exercise prepares you to tell a mother that her son will not be walking back through her front door. I wrote and rewrote the words until my hand cramped. I searched for honesty without cruelty, for compassion without false hope. When the time came, I dialed the number, my heart pounding louder than the distant hum of aircraft. A woman's voice answered, hopeful, bright. I told her the truth in the cleanest way I could. There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that shatters something deep inside. And then came the sobs. I held the phone, unable to stop the flood of grief, and I promised her that her son had served with honor, that he was not alone, that his name would never be forgotten. I hung up, but the echo of that call has never left me. It became a scar, invisible but heavy. I carried it with me into every mission afterward, a reminder of what command truly means. It is not medals or ceremonies. It is the weight of lives entrusted to you, lives that can vanish in a breath. I wonder if you have carried a responsibility that felt too heavy for your shoulders, something that no one else could see but you felt every day. If you have, share a little of it in the comments. Sometimes naming that weight makes it easier to carry. Afghanistan brought different terrain, different challenges, but the same test. Mountains that rose like jagged teeth, valleys that hid dangers in their shadows, and villages where children watched us with eyes too old for their years. We marched, we built, we fought, we endured. I learned that war was not just about battles. It was about patience, waiting in the dust for orders that might change in an instant. It was about writing reports while mortar fire echoed in the distance. It was about holding your soldiers together when the world threatened to tear them apart. Over the years, I built a reputation, though it was never the flashy kind. My name was not the one shouted across news feeds. I was not the commander whose speeches made headlines. My reputation came from something quieter, from showing up on time, from following through on promises, from being fair even when fairness cost me. Soldiers came to trust that if I said something, I meant it, that I would stand beside them in the mud, in the heat, in the dark. That was enough, more than enough, because soldiers do not need idols. They need leaders who will not walk away. There was a night in Kandahar when a sandstorm ripped across our position, blotting out the sky and choking every breath. Tents collapsed, radios went silent, and for hours we were cut off from everything. I gathered the soldiers in the mess tent, the walls rattling as the storm screamed outside. Fear flickered in their eyes, young men and women who wanted desperately to be anywhere else. I told them what I had always believed. Storms pass, fear fades. What matters is that we stay together. We waited it out, shoulder to shoulder, and when dawn broke clear, the first thing they looked at was not the wreckage, but at me. Steady, present, that was all they needed. It was in those moments that I made my personal vow. If forced to choose, I would choose to stand tall, to speak the truth, to do what was right even when no one was watching. That vow carried me through promotions, through sleepless nights, through decisions that left marks no one else could see. Do you have a vow like that, a line you drew for yourself that you refuse to cross no matter what? If so, write it down in the comments. You never know who might need the courage of your words tonight. By the time I returned stateside for good, my hair was streaked with gray, my hands rough from years of paperwork and weapons both, and my heart heavy with names that would never leave me. Yet I carried something else too. A sense of dignity that no insult could erase, or at least, that is what I told myself. Because the truth is, even after 25 years of sand, even after losses and victories both, a single sentence from my father could still cut me down. Coming home after deployments was always strange. The world moved at a different pace. Streets were too quiet. The grocery store aisles were too bright. Families laughed in parking lots while I stood at the edge, trying to remember what it felt like to belong. At first, I thought the unease would fade, that I would slip back into American life as easily as a pair of worn boots. But the truth is, the sand never left me. I carried it in the creases of my skin, in the way I scanned rooftops even in small towns, in the way I braced at fireworks on the 4th of July. The war had seeped into me, and though the uniform came off at night, the weight never did. There were evenings when I would sit in my apartment outside Fort Campbell, lights off, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. My desk was stacked with folders, after-action reports, memos needing signatures. Promotions were coming, I knew that. My commanders had made it clear. Yet the victories were not loud. They came in the form of being asked to stay late, to carry another unit through inspections, to guide another group of young officers who had not yet learned the weight of command. Promotions were not celebrations. They were late nights in conference rooms where coffee had gone cold, where the walls were covered with charts and timelines. They were folders passed across desks with a quiet nod. They were responsibilities piling higher than medals ever could. I rose slowly but surely from major to lieutenant colonel. Each new rank felt less like a reward and more like a reminder that the margin for error grew thinner. I wonder if you know that feeling, when success does not glitter but simply grows heavier on your shoulders. When the world sees an achievement, but you feel only the increased weight of expectation. If you do, share a piece of it in the comments. Someone listening might need to know they are not the only one carrying that invisible load. Loneliness came in waves. Some nights I called soldiers by name in my dreams, hearing their voices as clearly as if they were still with me. Other nights I sat in the glow of a single lamp, staring at the photograph of my mother in her nurse's scrubs, her tired smile steady as ever. She had been gone for years by then, yet I still leaned on her memory, as if she were a hand on my shoulder. My father rarely called. When he did, the conversations were brief. He asked about weather, about the town, about nothing that mattered. He never asked what it was like to lose soldiers under my watch. He never asked how it felt to salute flag-draped coffins. He never once said he was proud. I told myself I did not need it, that I had built a life strong enough to stand without his approval. But deep down, I knew the wound had never closed. At Fort Campbell, I trained officers who would go on to lead troops of their own. I taught them that leadership is not noise but presence. That soldiers remember not the words you shout, but the steadiness you embody when storms hit. I told them stories of failure and of resilience, never dressing them up, always laying the truth bare. Some listened. Some did not. The Army has a way of teaching lessons eventually, even if you refuse them at first. By 45, I wore the eagle of a colonel. It gleamed silver on my shoulders, a symbol of years spent in deserts, in barracks, in conference rooms long after everyone else had gone home. When I looked at that insignia in the mirror, I did not see glamour. I saw sacrifice. I saw nights of exhaustion, mornings of grit, and the names of soldiers who would never come home. Yet outside the army, little had changed. My father remained the same sharp-edged man, his words still cutting even when delivered softly. When I visited the old house, now worn and tired, he would point to the porch he had repaired or the chair he had built, as if those boards and nails were the only legacy that mattered. I listened, nodded, and left with the familiar ache of dismissal. It is a strange thing to be saluted by strangers yet dismissed by your own blood. Have you ever known that contradiction, where one world values you while another refuses to see you? If you feel like sharing, tell me about it in the comments. It may help someone who has lived the same fracture between recognition and rejection. In those years, I poured myself into work. My calendar was full, my days relentless. I thought if I filled every hour, there would be no room for the emptiness that lingered when the uniform came off. And it worked for a time. Success became a shield. Duty became a companion. Then came the invitation. A cream-colored envelope, my name spelled almost right, delivered by mail months before the wedding. Inside was an announcement written in elegant script. My father, Ray Coleman, would be marrying Marla Reed in the church hall of our hometown. He was 64. She was younger, eager, determined to make a new beginning. I stared at the card, unsure if I should laugh or cry. After decades of absence, of dismissal, of silence, he wanted me to come stand in a pew while he began again. My first thought was to ignore it, to let the past stay buried. But then Aunt Ruth called. Her voice cracked with age, with loyalty, with the same tenderness she had always carried for me. "Honey," she said, "it would mean something if you came, even just to show your face." I hung up the phone and sat for a long time, the invitation heavy in my lap. Every instinct told me to stay away, to protect the scar that had never healed. But loyalty has its own pull, and family, no matter how fractured, has a way of calling you back. I packed my uniform that morning, not because I planned to wear it, but because habit runs deep. It lay folded inside a garment bag, tucked into the trunk of my car as I drove north on the interstate. The miles stretched out, each one carrying me closer to the town I had once promised myself I would leave behind. The day was warm, the sky streaked with thin clouds. I stopped at a gas station along the way, filled my tank, and bought a cup of coffee that tasted more like burnt rubber than beans. The ordinary details felt surreal, as if the world did not know the storm building in my chest. By the time I pulled into the church parking lot, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the horizon with the same colors I had seen years earlier in deserts half a world away. Trucks and sedans filled the lot, neighbors and cousins already inside. I slipped on a simple dress and flats, nothing that would draw attention. This was his day, not mine, or so I thought. I walked into the hall, the smell of coffee and polished wood thick in the air. People turned, whispered, smiled politely. Marla greeted me with a hug too stiff to mean much. Her daughter stood beside her, cheeks flushed, voice too loud. My father was at the front, his suit hanging loose on his shoulders, his hair slicked back with more effort than grace. For a brief moment, I let myself believe he might soften. That maybe he would look at me and finally see not just a daughter but the woman I had become. That maybe just once he would honor the miles I had walked. But when he raised his glass, his eyes fixed on mine, I learned again that hope can cut as deep as rejection. His words fell heavy in the hall, and everything I had carried through 25 years of sand suddenly felt small against the sting of a single sentence. That is where the story turns. That is where the silence grew louder than applause, where memory folded back on itself, and where I had to decide whether to let the insult stand or to face it clean. The church hall in Knoxville smelled of fresh polish and sheet cake, the kind with thick frosting and roses pressed from sugar. The folding chairs had been lined up neat, each one with a program tucked onto the seat. A string of white lights curled around the crossbeam overhead, flickering slightly as if even the electricity was nervous. I drove up in my Ford Explorer, the newer model with leather seats that still carried the faint smell of factory clean. I had checked into the courtyard by Marriott the night before, close enough to walk if I wanted, far enough to give me space when it ended. I had not wanted another night in that old house with its peeling paint and memories I could not shake. Inside the hall, people shifted in their seats, whispering with the kind of excitement only small towns can muster. Neighbors leaned over to catch up on gossip. Cousins I had not seen in decades craned their necks to spot me when I slipped in wearing a plain navy dress and flats. I chose a seat near the back, close to the door. Years of soldiering had taught me that sometimes an exit is as important as an entrance. Marla was radiant in a lace gown too young for her age, but filled with determination. Her daughter Jenna stood close by, hair pinned high, cheeks flushed with pride. She smiled at everyone who looked her way, the easy confidence of someone who had always been told she was enough. I studied her for a moment. 26, a coordinator at a clinic in town, proud of her path, steady in her step. I did not begrudge her any of it. Then my father stepped forward. His suit hung a little loose on his shoulders, his tie crooked despite the best attempts to straighten it. He lifted a glass of champagne, his voice clearing the chatter in the room. Family, he said, is what gives a man pride. For one fragile second, I thought maybe he would offer me grace. Maybe he would look back, see me sitting there, and speak of miles traveled and battles fought. I held my breath. Instead, his eyes cut to mine, sharp as a chisel, and he said, "Some people carry the name but never honor it." The room froze. You could feel the hush spread like a storm rolling through. Forks stopped. Chairs creaked. Somewhere in the back, a child whimpered before being hushed. My cousin Ruth gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The music died mid-note, as if the DJ himself could not believe what he heard. There are insults that sting in private, but when spoken in front of a crowd, they hollow the air. I heard my own breathing louder than the shuffle of feet, louder than the scrape of silverware. The words did not just strike me. They settled on everyone else, demanding they decide whether to look away or stare, whether to clap or keep still. I lowered my water glass onto the table, steady and slow, because my hands refused to shake. Then I rose. No words, no defense. I had learned long ago that sometimes silence is the only clean answer. I stepped out into the Tennessee afternoon. The air was heavy with summer, cicadas buzzing in the trees, their rhythm filling the silence left inside. The parking lot shimmered with heat rising from blacktop. I leaned against my Explorer, the metal warm beneath my palm, and let the sky steady me. Between the laughter trickling back from the hall and the cicadas crying in the branches, I thought of my mother. I saw her again in her nurse's scrubs, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, telling me, "Sarah, you do not have to fight every battle. But the ones you do, fight them clean." Standing there, I wondered if clean meant walking away forever, letting his words settle into the dust. Or if clean meant stepping back inside with the truth stitched across my chest, letting everyone see what I had built from every mile, every loss, every night I stood steady for soldiers who needed me. It is a strange thing how moments of humiliation force you into stillness. You measure the weight of silence. You weigh the cost of words. You decide if the scar will stay hidden or if you will peel back the bandage and let the world see. Tell me, if you were standing there in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have walked away and left his words to wither on their own, or would you have gone back inside and shown the truth? Share it in the comments. Your answer may be the one another listener is waiting for. I stayed outside longer than I meant to. The cicadas sang, the heat pressed down, and the memory of deserts far away folded into the Tennessee dusk. A soldier learns patience, but patience is not the same as surrender. I kept my eyes on the garment bag in my trunk, the sharp green of my uniform waiting inside, the silver eagle gleaming even in the dark. When I finally straightened, I knew that whatever choice I made, it had to be clean. Not loud, not bitter, clean. And that was the moment I began to turn back toward the hall, the weight of 25 years resting square on my shoulders, ready to be seen for what it truly was. I unzipped the garment bag, and the smell of pressed wool rose like memory itself. My hands moved slowly, almost reverently, sliding into sleeves that carried every scar and every vow of the past 25 years. The jacket fit snug against my shoulders. The ribbons lined across my chest like a ledger of years that no one could take away. I pinned the eagle onto my collar and felt the familiar weight settle into place. I looked at myself in the glass of the car window. Not Sarah, the daughter dismissed. Not Sarah, the awkward guest sitting at the back table. Colonel Sarah Coleman, United States Army. Every stitch had been earned. Every thread carried the truth of sacrifice. I drew a long breath, squared my shoulders, and whispered to myself the words my mother once told me. Stand clean. When I opened the hall doors again, the air conditioner rushed over me, cool and sharp against my skin. The music faltered, then died altogether. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Heads turned one by one until every pair of eyes was fixed on me. The sound of my shoes clicking against the floor echoed louder than any song the DJ could play. My father froze at the head table, his glass still in his hand, the smile he had been wearing collapsing into something harder. Marla stiffened beside him, her hand tightening around his arm. Jenna's eyes widened, the pride in her expression slipping into shock. I did not look away. I walked to the front with measured steps, each one steady, each one deliberate, not rushing, not hiding. When I reached the head table, I turned to face the room. My voice was calm when it came, low but clear enough that no one could mistake the words. I came here today to wish my father well. I did not come for insults. I did not come for shame. I am who I am, and I have earned it. Silence followed, thick as stone. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a chair creaked at the back of the room. My Aunt Ruth's hands trembled as she began to clap softly, her eyes wet. The sound was fragile at first, then stronger as others joined. Neighbors, cousins, even the veterans who had served their own tours of duty straightened in their seats and raised their hands in salute. The room filled with the sound of recognition, not noise but a rising wave of respect. Jenna shifted awkwardly, her wine glass shaking. Her lips parted as if she meant to speak, but no words came. She lowered her eyes, the flush in her cheeks a mix of embarrassment and something else. Perhaps realization. I turned slightly toward her. Any marine business belongs in the office, not in a wedding hall. She nodded once quickly, almost grateful for the mercy of being spared more. Then I lifted my own glass of water, steady in my hand. To dignity, I said, to standing clean when it matters. The clapping swelled. A man I did not know, a Vietnam veteran with a cap pulled low over his head, rose stiffly from his chair and saluted me. My throat tightened, but I returned it with crisp precision. That moment belonged not only to me but to every soldier who had ever been dismissed or overlooked, every woman who had been told she was less than the truth of her service. My father did not clap. He stood stiff, jaw clenched, his eyes locked on mine with something between fury and shame. For years I had chased that look, hoping it would soften into pride. It did not. But as the room applauded around him, his silence no longer carried the weight it once did. I did not stay long. I was not there to gloat. I let the applause wash over the room, then stepped away from the head table, passing through the rows of faces, each handshake and whispered, "Thank you more than enough." I reached the door and let the hum of cicadas outside replace the thunder of clapping behind me. The evening air smelled of honeysuckle and asphalt cooling in the twilight. I leaned against my Explorer, the uniform still sharp against my skin, and for the first time in years I felt something close to release. Not victory, not revenge, release. One by one people drifted outside as if they too needed air after what had unfolded. A veteran with a limp approached me, his hand outstretched. "Proud of you, ma'am," he said, voice gravelly. "We needed someone like you back then." I shook his hand firmly, the weight of his words pressing deeper than any applause. A woman I faintly remembered from church potlucks pressed my hand between hers. "Your mama would be proud," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. I thanked her softly, the ache of longing for my mother's presence stirring once more. Then Jenna came. She lingered at a distance first, fidgeting with her clutch, her bravado from earlier gone. When she stepped closer, her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "I didn't know," she said. "I mean, I didn't realize." I studied her face. "So young still, so desperate to be enough. You don't have to know everything yet," I answered. "But you do need to be honest. Bring your truth. That will carry you farther than any applause." She nodded, eyes wet, and hurried back inside. My father never came out, not that night. The only words from him came later in a voicemail I listened to back at the hotel. His voice was unsteady, stripped of the usual pride. "Sarah, I went too far. I should not have said it. I don't know how to fix it." The message ended there, no goodbye. I sat on the edge of the Marriott bed, the uniform draped neatly across the chair, and let the quiet settle. I thought of deserts and storms, of soldiers buried with folded flags, of my mother's steady voice reminding me what it meant to live clean. My father's apology, fragile and unfinished, could not erase the wound, but it did not need to. I had already stood in the truth, and the truth was enough. The next morning I drove to the cemetery where my mother rested. The grass was trimmed, the morning sun rising soft and golden. I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, my uniform pressed sharp, and whispered, "Mama, it's done." He spoke his words and I spoke mine, but I spoke them clean. The breeze stirred, carrying the faint smell of honeysuckle across the stones. If you have ever carried words that cut deeper than they should, you know how heavy they become. Maybe it was a parent, maybe a partner, maybe a stranger who struck at the core of you. If you feel like sharing, write those words in the comments. Sometimes speaking them aloud is the first step in taking their weight away. I left the cemetery with the windows rolled down, the Tennessee hills rolling by. For the first time in years, the road did not feel like an escape, but like a return. I was no longer chasing my father's pride. I was no longer trying to earn a name that had been mine all along. What I carried instead was something steadier. Dignity. Hard-won. Clean. Back in the quiet of the hotel room, the world felt muted, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the noise of Knoxville. The courtyard by Marriott was nothing grand, just neat walls and polished wood furniture, a bed with hospital-cornered sheets. I set my keys on the desk and lowered myself into the chair, the weight of the evening pressing on my chest like an extra pack I had carried too far. Across the room sat my suitcase. Inside, folded with deliberate precision, was the uniform I had kept ready. Not because I had planned for a scene, not because I wanted to steal anyone's spotlight. I had carried it because discipline never leaves you. 25 years in the Army teaches you that your uniform must always be within reach, and so it had been tucked beneath civilian clothes, waiting. I opened the case and unwrapped the layers. The Army green service uniform lay flat, the olive coat pressed smooth, the ribbons aligned, the silver eagle bright against dark fabric. My hands hovered over it for a moment. This was not armor and it was not costume. It was record and witness. Every patch, every badge, every row of color represented lives, sacrifices, miles walked under a foreign sun. I reached for my phone and scrolled until I found the name I needed. Colonel Marcus Davis. He had been my comrade since our first command in Georgia, the kind of man who told the truth even when you wished he would not. When he answered, his voice was steady, deep as riverbed stone. "Sarah," he said. I did not give him the details. I did not need to. He heard the weight in my silence and waited. Finally, I spoke. "My father stood up tonight and told a room full of people I was unworthy of his name." For a while, Marcus said nothing. I imagined him rubbing the scar across his jaw the way he always did when the right words were slow to arrive. Then he said, "Clean, Sarah. You do not need to argue. You do not need to explain. Show up as who you are. That is more than enough." The line went quiet again, then he added, "Do not wear it for him. Wear it so you remember. You built your life by your own steps. No one can take that." I thanked him and hung up, the sound of his words lingering like steadying hands at my back. I showered and dressed slowly. The olive jacket slipped over my shoulders with the familiarity of ritual. I fastened the buttons, aligned the ribbons, straightened the silver eagle on my collar. The low quarters shone, black leather reflecting the soft hotel light. I checked the tie knot, the cover folded with precise creases. Each step felt less like preparation for battle and more like remembrance of every mile I had already walked. In the mirror, I did not see revenge. I did not see a daughter desperate for approval. I saw a soldier who had carried responsibility through deserts and rain, who had signed her name on reports that meant life or death, who had sat with grieving families until the silence broke. My jaw was set, but my eyes were calm. I whispered to the reflection, "I do not wear this to win. I wear this to stand." For a moment, memory carried me backward. My mother in her nurse's scrubs, setting her lunch pail on the counter after a night shift. She would pour herself coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and tell me not to bow my head to anyone who tried to measure me small. "You do not need to fight every battle," she would say, "but the ones you choose, fight them clean." I felt her presence there in the quiet room, her words circling with Marcus's, guiding me back toward the hall where my father's voice had cut me down. The choice was no longer about him. It was about me standing in the truth I had built. When I stepped into the hallway, the carpet muffled my steps, but my heart beat loud and steady. The elevator hummed as it carried me down, each floor clicking past like a drumbeat of resolve. Outside, the Tennessee night was heavy with summer air. The parking lot lights glowed yellow against the dark. My explorer waited, but I did not rush. I stood a moment beneath the night sky, letting the cicadas' drone wash over me like a cadence. Before I returned, I paused and thought of you who are listening now. Maybe you have had to prepare yourself for a confrontation you never wanted, a moment where silence felt easier but truth demanded more. I wonder, have you ever stood in front of a mirror and reminded yourself who you are before facing someone who tried to shrink you? If you are willing, share that memory in the comments. You never know who might draw strength from your story. I opened the driver's door and slid inside. The steering wheel felt firm beneath my hands, the same hands that had held maps under red light, that had gripped radios crackling with bad news, that had steadied younger soldiers in the dark. Tonight they steadied me. The drive back to the church hall was only 10 minutes, but it stretched like miles. Each stoplight gave me space to breathe. Each turn reminded me that choice had brought me here. Not duty, not obligation, choice. When I pulled into the lot again, the sounds of laughter and music filtered faintly through the walls. Inside they carried on, perhaps forgetting, perhaps trying to. I straightened my jacket one last time, placed the cover under my arm, and drew a breath that filled my lungs all the way down. Clean, I whispered again. Then I stepped out into the night and toward the doors where my truth waited. The church hall doors loomed ahead, painted white with brass handles dulled by years of use. I reached for one and held still for a heartbeat. Inside, my father's voice had cut me open. Inside, neighbors and cousins had seen me diminished. I pressed my palm against the handle and felt the cool metal steady me. Then I pulled. The sound hit me first. A fiddle tune rising from the speakers, the scrape of chairs against the floor, bursts of laughter too loud to be natural. People had patched over the silence my father had left, trying to stitch the night back together with noise. But when I stepped through the doorway, the music faltered as if the air itself had shifted. My shoes clicked against the linoleum, echoing through the hall. Heads turned, conversations broke mid-sentence. I walked with measured steps, cover tucked beneath my arm, silver eagles on my shoulders catching the fluorescent light. For a moment I could almost hear my mother's voice saying, "Stand steady, Sarah, do not rush, do not bow." The crowd's reaction came in waves, first whispers, then a hush that spread like water across the room. A cousin near the back leaned toward another and murmured something I could not catch. An older veteran in a ball cap straightened in his chair and gave a small nod. Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming. I did not scan the room for approval. I walked toward the head table where my father stood with Marla, her sequin dress glittering under the lights. Jenna, her daughter, stood close by with a glass of wine cradled in her hand. Their laughter stilled when they saw me. My father's face froze first in surprise, then tightened into something harder. His jaw set the same way it had when I was 15 and dared to argue with him about curfew. But this time he did not speak right away. His eyes traveled over the uniform, the ribbons, the eagles gleaming. He blinked once, and I saw in that flicker the man wrestling with two truths at war inside him. I did not give a speech. I did not need to. I stopped at the edge of the table, raised the glass of water I had carried from the side, and said calmly, "I came here tonight to wish my father happiness. I did not come for insults, and I will not wear them." My voice carried without force, steady as a cadence. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the ice machine in the kitchen. My father's hand tightened around his champagne flute. He opened his mouth, closed it again. His cheeks flushed dark red. Jenna's eyes darted between us, her earlier bravado shrinking into silence. She set her glass down slowly, as if afraid to draw attention. Marla's smile faltered into something brittle, a mask struggling to hold. Then from the back, someone began to clap. It was one of the older veterans, his hand striking against his palm with deliberate rhythm. Another followed, then another. Soon the sound spread, hesitant at first, then rising until it filled the hall. Not raucous applause, not wild cheering. A steady, respectful recognition. I let it roll over me, but I did not bask in it. I stood where I was, shoulders square, glass raised. Finally, I lowered it and set it down. I turned toward Jenna, my voice soft but firm. "You are young, you have your own path to walk. But in this family, let truth come before pride. That is all I will say tonight." Her lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. She gave a quick nod and looked away. Then I faced my father. For the first time in years, I saw his eyes unshielded, stripped of bluster. He looked at me as if weighing the cost of what he had spoken and the weight of what stood before him now. But he said nothing. I did not push. I had not come to win an argument. I had come to stand. With that, I gave a small nod to the crowd, turned, and walked back down the aisle of folding chairs. The applause swelled once more, some voices murmuring words I could not quite hear. Outside, the summer night wrapped around me warm and heavy. The cicadas had not ceased their song. I drew in a long breath of air thick with honeysuckle and asphalt heat. My hands loosened at my sides. A few guests trickled out after me. An older man with a limp approached first. Vietnam vet, his cap told me. He extended his hand. "Proud of you, Colonel," he said, his voice rough but steady. "We needed leaders like you back then." I clasped his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." Another followed, a woman I remembered from church suppers decades ago. Her eyes glistened as she said, "Your mother would have been proud." I swallowed the ache rising in my throat. "She already was," I said gently. "That is what carried me this far." As more people drifted back inside, the lot grew quiet again. Marla emerged, her heels clicking against the pavement. She glanced at me but did not stop. Jenna followed behind, her steps slower, uncertainty written on her face. She paused a few feet away, then whispered, "I didn't understand." I studied her, saw the youth still clinging to her expression. "You do not need to understand all at once," I said. "You only need to be honest. That is the first step." She nodded quickly, eyes shining, and hurried after her mother. The doors shut behind them, leaving me alone with the cicadas and the glow of the street lamps. I walked to my Explorer and rested my hands on the roof for a moment, letting the cool metal ground me. My heart still beat heavy, but the sting had eased. I thought again of Marcus's words, "Do not wear it for him, wear it for you." Inside that hall, the lie had been spoken. Tonight it had been answered. Not with anger, not with humiliation, with presence, with truth. Driving back to the hotel, I kept the windows down, letting the night air wash through. Knoxville streets were quiet, neon signs buzzing above diners and gas stations. I passed them without stopping, my mind steadying with each mile. Back in the room, I hung the uniform carefully in the closet, smoothing the sleeves with my palms. It was not tarnished by tonight. If anything, it shone brighter, not because of what others had seen, but because I had remembered what it meant. I sat at the desk, turned off the lamp, and let the silence settle. For those of you still listening, I wonder if you have carried words that cut deep, words spoken by someone you trusted, maybe even someone who should have protected you. Did you ever find a way to stand in your truth without shouting? Share if you feel comfortable. Your story may be the hand someone else needs to hold steady tonight. I lay down and closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried me lighter than the night before. The wound was still there, but it no longer defined me. I had walked back into the room, and I had walked out clean. When I stepped back into that hall the second time, it was not the applause that carried me. It was the silence. The kind that feels heavier than noise, pressing against your chest until you either break or stand taller. The music had stopped, plates sat half-finished, forks stilled midair. Every eye followed me as I crossed the room, but no one rushed to greet me. No one rose in salute. This was not a battlefield, not a ceremony. It was family. Messy and unprepared for the truth that had just walked back through the doors in full dress uniform. I made my way to the front again, each step deliberate, each click of my shoes steady as a heartbeat. My father turned toward me. His hand still gripped the stem of his glass, but he had not lifted it again. His shoulders, once squared with defiance, sagged a little under the weight of so many eyes. I did not linger in that pause. I spoke, my voice low but carrying. "I wish you happiness, Dad. I do not need anyone here to measure my worth, but I will not leave unchallenged words that strip truth away." The room held still. The air itself seemed to wait. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jenna shift, her cheeks flushed, her hand trembling where it rested against the table. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her voice quivered but did not falter. "Ma'am," she said, "I am sorry for what I said before." It was not protocol. She did not salute. She did not try to cover her unease with jokes or pride. She spoke as one woman to another, plain and sincere. I gave her a small nod. "Honesty has weight," I told her. "You will be fine if you carry that first." Something shifted then. At the back of the room, an older man stood. I recognized him from the local Legion Hall, a veteran with hair silvered by years and hands calloused by labor. He did not salute, but he drew himself tall, spine straight, chin lifted. His eyes held mine with a quiet recognition that needed no words. One by one, others rose from their chairs. No clapping now, just the sound of feet against the floor and the rustle of fabric as people stood. It was a silent witness, a gathering acknowledgment that respect had found its place. The weight of the moment pressed closer, and then my father's voice broke through. Rough at first, catching in his throat, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "This is my daughter, Colonel Sarah Coleman." The words settled heavy like stones laid into place where cracks had run wide for decades. He did not reach for me. He did not soften with tears or apologies. It was not tenderness. But it was public, it was plain, and it was true. And that, after so many years, was enough. I breathed deep, letting the air fill the spaces the insult had hollowed out hours before. My father had spoken, not as a man trying to wound, not as a man hiding behind pride, but as a man correcting what he had set wrong. It was not redemption, not yet, but it was acknowledgment. For those of you listening, maybe you know the power of such moments. When someone who once diminished you finally, even haltingly, names you for who you are. Have you ever carried words so heavy they bent your back, only to have them lifted in a way you never expected? Share if you feel comfortable. You never know whose heart your truth might steady. Back in the hall, chairs creaked as people slowly sat down again. The music had not yet returned. My father lowered his glass, his hand trembling slightly. He did not look at me long, but he did not look away either. I stepped back then, letting the quiet linger just long enough, then moved toward the door. I had not come for applause, and I had not come to stay. I had come to stand. And now, with those few words spoken, the night had turned. The cicadas were still singing outside when I reached the lot, but the air felt lighter. Something in me had shifted with the room, and though the wound was not erased, it was no longer raw. The night after the wedding, I lay awake in the quiet of the hotel room. The air conditioner hummed against the Tennessee heat, and the curtains glowed faintly from the parking lot lights outside. Sleep would not come. I replayed the moment again and again, the way the hall had gone still, the sound of my father's voice calling me his daughter, the subtle tremor in his hand as he set the glass down. It was not a fairy tale ending. I knew better than to expect that. But it was something. A correction spoken aloud in front of those who had once heard him dismiss me. Sometimes that is all a wound requires to start closing. Not a grand apology, not years of making up for what was lost, but a single truth spoken clearly enough that it cannot be denied again. Morning light broke across the walls, pale and steady. I laced my shoes, slipped out before breakfast, and drove toward the cemetery where my mother rested. The gates were open, the grounds quiet except for the rustle of birds in the trees. I carried a small bundle of flowers, wild ones gathered from the roadside, nothing polished. My mother had never cared for perfect arrangements. She liked honesty in all things. I walked between rows of stones until I found hers. Margaret Ann Coleman, beloved mother, nurse. The grass was clipped short, the stone clean. I stood with my hands clasped behind me, a habit I had never broken from the army. "Mom," I whispered, "it is done." He said what needed saying. Maybe not with tenderness, maybe not with regret, but with truth. And I answered clean, the way you always told me to. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of honeysuckle from the fence line. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could see her standing in our old kitchen in her nurse's scrubs, hair pinned up, fatigue in her eyes but strength in her voice. She had carried me through childhood with the conviction that dignity was not something given, but something earned and held close. I placed the flowers at the base of the stone, brushed dirt from the carved letters, and stood for a long time in silence. When I turned to leave, the morning sun had climbed higher, and the world felt a little lighter. Back at Fort Campbell, life resumed its rhythm. Morning formations, briefings that stretched into afternoons, stacks of paperwork that never seemed to shrink. No one there asked about the wedding. Soldiers do not pry into personal wounds. But somehow word travels in quiet ways. A sergeant I had mentored years ago stopped me in the hallway, his eyes steady as he said, "We are proud to serve under you, ma'am." That was all, but it carried more weight than any elaborate tribute. A few days later, a voicemail arrived. My phone buzzed against the desk as I reviewed training schedules. It was my father. His voice was rough, slower than usual. "Sarah, I went too far. Shouldn't have said it the way I did. I don't know how to make it right." The message ended without a goodbye. I listened twice, then set the phone down. I did not rush to call back. Some bridges need time to bear weight again. Yet hearing him name the wrong aloud, even privately, was more than I had expected when I drove to Knoxville. Maybe age had softened him, maybe the silence in that hall had spoken louder than my uniform ever could. Weeks passed. Training cycles turned. I presided over a change of command ceremony, the flag snapping in the Kentucky wind, the band playing sharp and steady. Families filled the seats, children restless in their Sunday clothes. As I stepped to the podium, I caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. My father. He wore a sport coat that hung loose on his frame, his hair thinner than I remembered, his tie crooked. He stood alone. He waited until the line of families thinned before approaching. He did not reach for me with arms or apologies. Instead, he extended his hand, his voice clear enough for others to hear. "This is my daughter, Colonel Sarah Coleman." It was simple, almost awkward, but it was true. For the first time, he had chosen the words in front of my world, not just his. I shook his hand, nodded once, and let the moment stand. There was no need for more. Later that evening, driving home with the windows down, I thought about how small gestures sometimes carry the greatest weight. My father would never rewrite the past. He would never undo the years of silence, the words that cut deep. But he had spoken the truth at last, and he had spoken it publicly. That was enough for me. For those of you listening, maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you carry scars from words spoken by people who should have loved you most. Maybe you never got the apology you deserved, or maybe you did, but it came late, clumsy, almost reluctant. And yet it still mattered, because it acknowledged what had been denied. Have you ever had that moment? If you are willing, share it below. Someone else may need to know they are not alone in waiting for truth. As summer deepened, I made another trip to the cemetery. I stood before my mother's grave and told her what had unfolded, that he had named me daughter at last without bitterness, that I had answered clean. I did not ask her if she would be proud. I already knew. The cicadas sang in the trees again as I left, their steady chorus rising with the heat. And I thought of how dignity does not require applause, but sometimes a room needs to witness it so they can carry it into their own lives. To those hearing my voice now, remember this. The worst words ever spoken about you do not define you. What defines you is the work you have done, the miles you have walked, the truth you have carried steady through storms. Family can wound deepest because they know where the cracks lie, but cracks do not hold a life together. The mortar does, the showing up, the clean fight, the refusal to let lies stand unchallenged. So if this story finds you in a place of doubt, take heart. You are more than the insults, more than the silence. You are the steady work of your own hands, and that cannot be erased. Before we close, I would love to hear from you. Where have you found the strength to stand tall when others tried to cut you down? Was it in your work, your faith, your friendships, or in quiet resilience only you could feel? Share your stories in the comments. You never know who might draw courage from them. That is what I carry from Knoxville. Not the sting of insult, not even the halting correction, but the reminder that truth, once spoken clean, has the power to shift a room, to steady a life, to pass strength from one heart to another. And as I drove away that night, the highway stretching long ahead, I felt something I had not in years. Peace. The morning after the wedding, the air was clear in Knoxville. A light breeze carried the smell of cut grass across the hills, and the sky opened wide and blue. I drove to the cemetery before the sun had fully climbed, carrying a small coin in my palm. It was nothing grand, just a quarter polished from years in my pocket. I placed it gently on my mother's stone, a soldier's way of saying I was here. Her name was carved in steady letters, Margaret Ann Coleman, and though the years had taken her from me too soon, her voice still lived inside my chest. She had told me once that dignity was not about the noise you made, but the way you carried yourself when no one was watching. That morning I stood in silence, hands behind my back, the coin glinting in the early light, and I thought about what had shifted in that church hall the night before. Not a grand reconciliation, not a healed family, but a correction spoken aloud. A moment where truth held its ground. The birds stirred in the trees. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I turned to leave. And I carried with me the simple peace of knowing I had answered clean, that I had stood where I needed to stand. Weeks later, the cycle of duty rolled on. At Fort Campbell, the parade field was dressed for a change of command. Flags snapped in the late summer wind. Rows of soldiers stood in crisp formation, their boots aligned as if drawn by a single line. Families filled the folding chairs, children fidgeting in Sunday best, cameras lifted to catch a glimpse of fathers and mothers in uniform. I stepped to the podium, ribbons catching the sun, and spoke words that were not about me but about the regiment, about the honor of service, about carrying forward the trust we had been given. My voice carried across the field, steady, measured, not for applause but for remembrance. When the ceremony ended, handshakes and congratulations flowed as they always did. And then I saw him. My father Ray standing quietly at the back, no fanfare, no Marla at his side. His hands were folded in front of him, his sport coat too large for his frame. He had listened through every word. He waited until the line thinned. Then he stepped forward, his eyes less sharp than they once were, but clearer somehow. He extended his hand and said the words I never thought I would hear in that place. "I am proud of you, Sarah. Nothing more, no speeches, no attempt to rewrite the past." Just a sentence spoken in the open air where soldiers and families could hear. The right words in the right place at the right time. I shook his hand, the weight of his grip frail but present. For once, there was no bitterness tucked inside. And I understood then that I did not need a perfect father or a flawless family to stand as myself. I only needed that one clean moment of truth. Driving home that evening, the Tennessee sky stretched wide, streaked with gold from the setting sun. I rolled the window down and let the warm air rush through, the hum of the tires steady beneath me. For the first time in a long while, I felt the wood inside me stand straight, unbent by years of wind and weather. Maybe that is the lesson I carry for anyone listening now. You may never receive all the apologies you deserve. You may never get the childhood you should have had. But sometimes one clear moment of honesty is enough to let you set the rest down. If you have lived through something similar, I wonder what your moment was. Was it a word spoken late but finally true? Was it a look, a nod, or a hand extended? Share it in the comments if you feel ready. Your story might be the light that steadies someone else's path. For me, the story does not end with triumph or with bitterness. It ends with balance. A father who finally spoke pride where once he spoke shame. A daughter who stood not to fight but to be seen cleanly. And a truth that stood taller than insult. The wood stands straight, and so do I. Before you leave, if this story has touched you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Not for me, but so these stories of resilience can find others who need them. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these words can travel and whose hearts they can reach.